What you see is another experimental video I wanted to try out on my channel. For those of you who saw the C2 Melt Amber Mechanics guide, I added a VoD review section near the end of the guide. This video format will be identical to that section, where I go into details about my thought process, decision making, strategies, mistakes, etc. that I couldn't cover in the text commentary of the starter characters only run for version 4.1. Like in the guide, I'll be slowing down the footage or pausing it to elaborate on some parts. However, for the sake of shortening the video length, I'll only talk about two halves. I'll discuss the first half of Chamber 1 and the second half of Chamber 2 because those were the chambers I wanted to talk about the most. Now, right at the start of Chamber 12.1.1, I already see something that can be slightly optimized. Applying cryo on the enemies slows their animation. There wasn't a need for me to apply cryo as early as I did in the footage because I stalled on Amber right after anyway, so Kaya's skill would have still come off cooldown by the time I swapped to him a second time. I could have waited until around 1 to 2 seconds before the Electro Shield appeared before using Kaya's skill. At the same time, I still want to make sure I do this whole process early enough to ensure Lynette casts her burst before the Electro Shield appears, so I don't accidentally infuse Electro. Going ahead a bit in the footage, there is another mistake I made. Specifically, I got a bit greedy here, thinking I had enough time to dash after I swapped to Lynette when I should have dodged first before swapping. Being greedy like this isn't something I would recommend to other players because it's a negligible time save. If you're unsure that you have enough time to dodge an attack after swapping to a character, I would play it safe and focus on dodging the attack first before swapping to characters. As for my thought process here, after breaking the Seahorse's shield, I immediately threw down Baron Bunny to manually detonate for extra pyro particles because the Seahorse was stunned. That is, as long as I don't take too long to detonate Baron Bunny, the boss had no chance of knocking the bunny away. Something I noticed immediately after was that I funneled the pyro particles into Lynette instead of Xiangling. It would have been better to swap to Xiangling first instead of Lynette to catch the pyro particles on Xiangling. Additionally, at this point in time, 6 seconds have already passed for the Favonius weapon cooldowns on both of these characters. Thus, swapping to Xiangling here first would have also allowed me to funnel her white particles into Lynette, who, in my experience, struggled the most with energy on my team. Fortunately, even though the funneling wasn't as optimized as I had hoped for, it was still good enough to get everyone's burst back for the next rotation. Here, I'd like to mention something important about one comment I made on this video in the first half of Chamber 3. I mentioned showing a way to swirl both Pyro and Cryo in this team. To recapitulate, after casting Amber's Burst, Kaya's skill, and Kaya's Burst in that order, it should still leave a Pyro aura for Lynette to swirl with her skill. Kaya should, in theory, reapply Cryo for Lynette to swirl with her Burst. But I eventually found out that I wasn't actually swirling Cryo 100% of the time. Against the Seahorse, I did successfully swirl Cryo. However, in later chambers like Chamber 3, you'll see that the swirl text sometimes doesn't appear after I cast Lynette's Burst. Kaya's ICD on his Cryo application was an oversight on my part, and I apologize for not paying attention to this, but I do have some ideas to still swirl Cryo. One way would be to stall a bit on Lynette after casting her burst, so the anemo damage from the damage over time tick would trigger the swirl reaction while she's on field. The other way would be to delay Lynette's burst a bit until Kaya applies cryo again, though I do need to make sure Lynette casts her burst before the anemo particles from her skill reach her. Resuming the 12.1.1 footage, I got a bit lucky with this next part because Amber's turn coincided with the end of the Seahorse's attack, so I used this as a chance to detonate another bunny for the extra pyro particles. Again, I probably should have focused on funneling the pyro particles into Xiangling instead of going linearly through the rotation. Now, this next part was probably the biggest mistake I made in the entire run. I accidentally let the Seahorse initiate its Fontamer Hoar Thunder attack. This happened because of my tendency to spam normal attacks when I shouldn't. To give some more context, when I'm on a melee character, I'd sometimes still spam left click on my mouse when I'm trying to use a skill or burst, which sometimes causes the active character to register the input from left clicks before the skill or burst. For this fight specifically, I normal attacked on Kaya a bit instead of used his skill into burst, so I didn't deal cryo damage to the shield fast enough to stun the Seahorse. In the future, to prevent this from happening again, I need to develop some discipline on left clicking so I don't add unnecessary normal attacks. As for why this was a big mistake, look at how much time I lost because of this habit. I first stand there a bit to wait for the resonant coral orbs to spawn, then I need to spend time shooting those orbs. Lastly, I have to wait for the Seahorse to descend. All this consumed about 11 seconds on the Spiral Abyss timer, which, for the context of a starter character's only run, is a large amount of time lost. The only reason I didn't reset this run was that I still cleared this half with a decent amount of time for the other side. This mistake ended up messing with my energy economy on the team as well, so I had to improvise for the rest of the fight. I decided to open up with Amber's Baron Bunny because, once again, the Seahorse was stunned, so it had no chance of knocking the bunny away. Here, I finally funneled the pyro particles into Xiangling, which helped a lot with getting her burst back at the start of the second chamber. However, looking back at this footage, there wasn't a need for me to cast Amber's burst here, as it doesn't contribute much damage to the fight. Given that Amber is the noblesse user, I believe it would have been better to save that for the next chamber to buff everyone at the start of the chamber. Near the end of the fight, we see another example of why I shouldn't be greedy with rushing the rotation. I took another unnecessary hit that I could have easily avoided by dodging first before swapping to Amber. Now that we've ended the first half of the first chamber, I'll now talk about the second half of the second chamber. For the second half of chamber 2, the most important thing to remember is when to engage Coppelia and when to back off. Even though this boss attacks frequently, there are still opportunities to move closer to Coppelia without taking much damage. The first example is at the beginning of the fight. I took that small chance to get energy with Lisa's hold skill, but I immediately backed off right after I cast her burst because Coppelius always starts the fight with an AoE spin attack. Next, I made a small mistake here. I mistimed the dash on Dendro Traveler and accidentally ran into Coppelius when he was still in the middle of his attack animation, so I took an unnecessary hit. I should have waited about a second longer before engaging Coppelia. I already mentioned this in the video, but it's important to point the camera toward Coppelius to see when to dodge his cryo attacks. However, there's something I could have done just slightly better when dodging the cryo attacks. When I dashed for iframes, I should have dashed around Coppelia instead of away from her because Barbara's skill was active. Staying near Coppelia would have allowed more chances for Barbara's skill to apply Hydro for more Dendro cores. About the attack patterns again, after Coppelius fires off his cryo attacks, that's the cue to distance yourself from Coppelia. Unfortunately, we see another instance of me trying to be greedy and consequently taking damage. Instead, what I should have done was wait until I saw the first AoE attack from Coppelia before using Dendro Traveler's skill. This would have prevented the risk of bringing Dendro Traveler's HP down to critical health. At the start of the second round of Coppelia's climax, I made the mistake of forgetting to move away from the center because of the initial AoE spin attack from Coppelius, so I was forced to use Barbara's burst to save myself. On a related note, I think it's worth mentioning how I use Barbara's burst in this team. Most of the time, I don't actually use Barbara's burst for its intended purpose, which is to heal everyone on the team. Instead, because this burst for some reason has a huge number of iframes, I use it to nullify a damage for a long period of time. I find that there aren't many situations where I need to use it for healing, so I personally prefer to use it to avoid damage in the first place. Another example of me using Barbara's burst purely for iframes was during the fight against the experimental field generator. During the attack that pummels the player with debris, Barbara's burst can last long enough to iframe every debris. I did cast her burst a little late and took one hit, but I nevertheless still nullified most of the damage. One other thing is that if you intend to use Barbara's burst for iframes, try to stand next to the enemy first before casting the burst, so you're still in range for Barbara's skill to apply Hydro while you're stuck in a burst animation. Doing this will probably only spawn at most one extra Dendro core, but in my case, Hyper Bloom does around 30,000 damage. I don't consider it negligible damage, so I do have an incentive to stay near the enemy while locked in Barbara's burst animation. Going back to the 12-2-2 footage, once again, I back up because Coppelia will unleash her AoE attacks, though in the footage, I noticed that I didn't actually stand far enough from her. Some characters still took damage, so I should pay more attention in the future if the Side A version of this boss reappears in the Spiral Abyss in the future. I also mentioned this in an original video already, but I lost a lot of Dendro cores in this fight because Coppelia knocked them away. However, I do notice that a lot of these Dendro cores could have been saved. For example, in this part of the footage, I had a decent amount of stamina at my disposal, so I could have walked behind these 3 Dendro cores and used Lisa's charge attack to proc Hyper Bloom on them. Same with this next part. If I had managed my stamina better, I could have taken this chance to proc Hyper Bloom on these Dendro cores too. Looking at the next part of the footage here, I noticed that I have a habit of throwing Kali's burst first before using the skill, and then swapping to another character. This is a bit inefficient for energy, because the energy conversion rate for off-field characters is 60%, so Kali does lose some energy here. At the same time, I will soon go for C2 Kali, so there might be some incentive to save her skill, so I can continue to trigger the 4-piece effect of Deepwood Memories with the extended skill duration from her C2 after the burst expires. I'll probably comment on this in the starter characters only run for version 4.2 Spiral Abyss if I am able to pull off a run for that version. Next, I didn't catch this until after I reviewed the footage, but Dendro Traveler's burst apparently didn't undergo transfiguration. Just for the extra damage output, what I should have done here is swap to Lisa and use her skill or charge attack to hit the Surgent Manifestation. Given that the Icewind Suite can now move, Lisa's burst becomes much more unreliable for hitting nearby targets with Electro. I ended up letting the surgeon manifestation stay in its normal form for a decent chunk of this fight. So I lost some DPS that I could have easily had if I spent that small amount of time to transfigure the manifestation. The rest of this fight isn't anything significant. I pretty much went on autopilot mode at this point and just went through all the characters to spawn more particles and refill everyone's burst meters back for the next chamber. And that's pretty much the end of this VoD review. Once again, this is an experimental video that mimics the VoD review section of the C2 Melt Amber Mechanics Guide. Let me know if you want to see me do this again in future versions. If you viewers like this video format, what I have in mind is that in future versions, I'll make a poll in the community tab asking what chambers you'd like me to VoD review. That way, I can get a better idea of what people want to see. However, one thing I should probably be transparent with is that this video is the most time-consuming video to make out of all Spiral Abyss related videos on my channel. Given that I'm currently a full-time graduate student, I might not be able to do this every version. But if I'm pretty confident that I have enough time to produce a VoD review near the end of the Spiral Abyss version, I'll definitely let you all know in the community tab. With that out of the way, I'll see you all in the next video.